welcome to this month's edition of the 0 to 1 program, where we take you on a journey into the Filecoin ecosystem. Today, we have a very special guest, a legend in the Filecoin space, Mr. Stuart Berman from PikNik, Program Director for ESPA. Stu, how are we doing today?
Fantastic. Looking forward to spending a few minutes with everybody here.
Yeah, we have so much to cover today on our topic, architecture. So we want to dive straight into it. So Bob, my trusty co-host as always, is here. Bob, how are we doing today?
Very good, and thrilled to have indeed Stu over here with all his experience in this ecosystem. So, who else to talk to about architecture than Stu?
All right, Bob, let's kick it off. We have a lot to get to today in our conversation with Stu, so let's dive in after you.
Architecture is indeed a very broad topic, and it could take a lifespan to talk about everything. So we have to pick our cherries here, and a couple topics I want to cover with Stu is like the balance also there is to be considered as a starting storage provider between the technical aspects and the technical architecture and sealing capacity and the financial aspects, because both go hand in hand. Let's talk about some do's and don'ts in architecting your solution. And let's talk about a reference architecture that we as Protocol Labs and Filecoin come forward with, which is by no means the only way to do it. And we can have a discussion on the good, the bad, and the ugly of that architecture with Stu. So, Stu, you're ready for it?
Oh, absolutely. Where should we start?
Well, maybe with the first question. So I open with the statement that there's a balance to be looked after in terms of technical aspects and financial aspects.
Right.
What would that mean for you?
Right. So I think that's a critical question. And, you know, I've been part of the community for years now, since prior to launch, and it's one that often isn't being given a good answer, but it's like the most important question, which is really, what are you trying to accomplish, right? And what are you trying to accomplish is really your hopes and dreams, but it's really like, what are you bringing to the table? Are you here to just learn about it? Are you trying to build a big commercial operation? You have a lot of money, you've got a business already, or investors that want to dump a bunch of money into it. What are you hoping to get out of it, right? What is your goal, your end goal? And if you don't have the business drivers right, everything else is going to be a bit of a swamp. So you've absolutely got to get that portion right. And so one of the things we've discussed recently was two key principles I want people to understand as we think about architecture and as we think about getting into Filecoin. And that is, you got to think about how big you want to grow and how quickly you want to grow, because that's going to have huge implications on the kind of financing you need, the kind of hardware you need. It's really the basis for the architecture. I mean, think about, like, we think about architecture like people building houses. You don't go and say, well, I'm going to build this big mansion unless you know, okay, I've got the funding, here's what I want the house to accomplish. It's going to have a lot of people. It's just going to be me, living by myself. That's the foundation of everything. So get the architecture, get the foundation right. Why are you doing this? What do you want to get out of it? Over time, things can change, right? You discover things and you can, decide to pivot, but start with a plan that is really grounded in those questions.
Yeah, totally agree. And your two key aspects of knowing how big you want to go and how fast you want to fill that capacity, or two different things indeed. So the one is about how much of a storage you can host, but don't forget there's a financial side, not only on the hardware side, but also on the collateral side with that. Right. And then how fast you want to achieve that full storage, or that storage pool to be filled up, is about your sealing capacity that you can do yourself or with sealing as a service, but also their cost factors, both for as a service and for buying your own hardware. So it takes proper planning. That is actually what you want to say. Right.
So again, I hope everyone here will kind of remember these two principles, right? One is the amount of fill you have, the amount of collateral, the amount of capital you bring to the table, or how much you borrow, will determine how big you get to grow. That of course is connected to how many hard drives you have, how much storage you have, but you can only grow as large as you have capital in terms of the amount of filled collateral you have. How fast you're going to grow will be the type of hardware, the amount of compute you have, how many TIBs you can seal every day or every hour. So think about that, as part of your architecture plan, is how much collateral am I going to have? How much access to that capital am I going to have? And then the type of hardware or the type of operating expenses if you're going to use sealing as a service, right?
Yeah.
Because those are the two main levers you have, assuming, you understand how to work in the ecosystem, and, you kind of got all the basics and everything else is there. So
Yeah.
get those two, understand those two levers, and that'll help you with your plans.
Hey,
Totally
I
agree.
just want to jump in here quickly. For those of you who don't know Stu obviously has been around Filecoin for multiple years and is also the program director at ESPA, which is our accelerator program for new storage providers entering the ecosystem. And Stu, I think as part of ESPA, you've worked with well over 70 new storage providers as they begin their journey into Filecoin. And you think back about all of the organizations you've helped along the way, what are some of the best practices when thinking about our architecture, and what are some of the pitfalls that you've seen over
Sure.
the past couple years?
Sure. I wish every story was just pure happiness and delight and profit. But unfortunately, it doesn't always start off that way. I think some of the saddest tales I've heard or been part of is having people that come to ESPA, they have big plans, they've already done a lot of investment in hardware, and it turns out for some reason they misunderstood the actual requirements. They didn't understand things. So what I've seen, for instance, is a very, very large operator who's no longer in the community now, but they were standing up a very, very large operation. And instead of buying hard drives, they were buying solid state, SSDs or NVMe, which are extremely expensive and made no sense whatsoever, but it cost them an absolute fortune. And they thought that was going to put them ahead of the pack. And it bought them nothing other than heartache and, something on their balance sheet that they couldn't readily deal with. So it kind of put them into a tailspin right off the bat. In other cases, people simply didn't understand how the components fit together. Like, you need so many GPUs, you need so much CPU, you need so much memory. It's a complex dance as you scale up. I started, with a single machine, an old crypto miner that I kind of jacked up. I added more memory, I added a nice GPU to it, and bought a bunch of disks, and I was able to successfully learn from a little starter unit for myself. It wasn't capable of, being a full-blown SP, but it really was enough for me to understand. And so if you don't have the practical experience, it's really, really tough. And, that's one of the beauties of ESPA, and maybe the message you should get from me going away from here is you've got to work with others in the community. You've got to talk to people. Don't think you're holding some big secret in terms of your hardware architecture and how you can run your system. Talk to others, learn the tips and secrets. We're very open at ESPA. We give you everything we know about, what works, what's been successful. We also talk about coming developments in the architecture. And that's something that is sometimes difficult for people to grasp. This is not a system that's static. It continues to evolve. We see new things coming in the next few months that are going to really improve efficiency, but it would also tell me if I'm going to buy equipment today, I might design things differently than I had 2 years ago. So you got to stay on the top of the fact that both the software and even the hardware requirements are changing over time as we try to be more energy efficient and get more bang from our buck.
Yeah. So with all the choices to be made and all the options there are and all the evolution there still is, I mean, this is still bleeding edge software and technology. So how would you plan as a new storage provider for hardware choices for an architecture where you don't shoot yourself in the foot, where you don't lock yourself in?
Well, again, I would go back to some of the earlier elements we talked about. What are you trying to accomplish? what's your timeline look like? You know, are you like, I've got a pile of cash and I've got to build something, I got to build it today? Or like in my example, it's like, I've got time to learn. I'm gonna learn everything thoroughly. I'm gonna start off small. I'm gonna build a test system, and I'm gonna expand that and grow and learn slowly. That's ideal for somebody getting into this system that doesn't have a lot of capital, but they're really interested and they want to, you know, maximize their dollar in terms of, you know, not having a lot to throw at it. On the other hand, you've got plenty of moneyers, you got money, you got lots of investors, or you've got lots of, you know, capital or loans available. Learn from others, talk to others, come to ESPA, talk to people in the community, people that are big, and they'll give you plenty of advice. But ultimately, you've got to understand really what you're trying to do. One of the hot new topics is sealing as a service. And with sealing as a service, instead of buying the most expensive sealing equipment, you can go and outsource that to a third-party provider where they're going to do the sealing for you. Now, economically, you know, if I'm a CFO, I'm going to say, well, why wouldn't we do that? You know, why wouldn't we invest the money instead of giving somebody else the profit? Maybe I can build a huge sealing cluster and not only use it for my own needs, but offer it to the community as a service. So you could go two different ways with that, right? And one of the beauties of what I'm seeing happen in the ecosystem is the software and the systems are becoming much more modular. So you don't have to do everything, right? There's now kind of talk about those of us that do everything, you know, that we have like a business development side, sales, we're trying to sell storing data as a service. We've got the hardware, the infrastructure, we're trying to compute over data. And then there's other SPs who want to narrowly define a specialty. I just want to store data. I don't want to get into the business development side, right? So they're going to target themselves slightly different. So for instance, in your diagram here, you have a boost node. The boost node is used for handling deals, both storage deals and retrieval deals. Well, depending upon what you're doing in the community, you might need a very large system there in terms of the amount of bandwidth and how much you're driving through that. Or in some cases, I've got a client who's going to have a closed system where they're not going to connect to the internet. They're going to do everything across, you know, internal links that never touch the internet. And so they've got a different design. They're not going to buy a large internet connection. They're going to use really a metropolitan area network to take their private data and ingest it into the Filecoin system. So
you made a perfect segue into the reference architecture picture with that. Well done. And actually, it will cover the question from someone on the Q&A, Subhasis. So what's the minimum requirement for hardware? It's a question we often get from a lot of people, but it comes back down to the initial statement that you make. What are you trying to achieve? So that's why we kind of said, okay, let's make a reference architecture for 1 petabyte raw setup, which is a good starting point to become a decent operation or to scale into a decent operation. Anything lower than that is probably not being planned to grow bigger than that.
right.
So looking at this reference architecture, it's one way of doing it, and you already picked out the boost component that could require a more hefty server, more resources, not sitting behind the firewall because the firewall will become your bottleneck, all those kind of things. But what on this would you recommend? Like, okay, this is well
Right.
thought of that you should also incorporate into your architecture.
Right. So I love that you've put the two internet-facing components, the daemon and the boost node, out there by themselves on the edge. And again, you have to go back to what are you building for? If you're simply going to store private, a public data that, is freely available to the public, the security needs might look very different than, storing healthcare data. The architecture, although it's not drawn here, I would say those two machines really need to be in a DMZ type setup. This is well known in network architecture where you're isolating those two components from each other and from the rest of your internal network. And that is because organizations that have secure data that they want secured, they got to make sure that that an attack from the internet upon your systems can't be successful and take advantage of, all the data that's stored in the back end. So that's the first step is, there's a security need. What are them? What are the security needs? Protecting the daemon is all about the chain and frankly, your wallets. So you've got to be careful in terms of protecting your supply of fill. The boost node, of course, is your entryway into the actual data, both storing it and retrieving it. So make sure you treat those with the appropriate amount of security based on the kind of risk you're willing to tolerate and the kind of data owners or customers and clients that you will have. So that's really the first thing. That's the first stepping stone. The rest of this can be and should be all isolated and separate from the rest of those devices in terms of no direct access from the internet and no easy access between those points and these other components. The sealing cluster, you've done a nice job, showing some of the ways you could architect this. It's not the only way you would do it. It really depends on scale in terms of how you break it down. But this is a very common way of breaking out the PC1s, which require the AMD EPYC processor and the SHA extensions, and break them out from the GPU-driven processes down in the PC2 and C2 world. So that's very common. There's a lot that you have to figure out in terms of let's call it the orchestration. We have to fine tune the amount of sectors that can be processed and what order that goes in and what's the cadence. So you don't want some workers idle all the time while the others are overloaded, right? And that takes some experience. Again, talk to people, help you understand that. But there are ways to figure that out in terms of the ideal flow of data going through your sealing system. Or you can also look at sealing as a service, which connects you to third-party services. There's, of course, a hybrid version, which is I want to seal up to my capacity, and then use sealing as a service is really overflow, right? I've got a really busy period where I've got to seal a lot of data much more quickly than I've got capacity, so I'll outsource that to third-party services. I know Aligned is one of the ones that we've been talking about a lot recently, where they can do that as a third-party service. Yeah. And then you've got your other components, right? Your miner, the actual storage arrays, the post workers. There's a lot of sense in the architecture you have here. I will say that storage is one of those things you really got to think hard about as you scale up. So it's small scale, not that big of a deal, but as you get larger and larger, managing multi-PIB storage arrays, you got to think carefully. So here you've used a ZFS RAID Z2 with the double parity. That's a great way to start. But there's always this tipping point where you get so large, you've got to really consider, okay, how's that being managed? Do I have the expertise in-house to, properly manage that and maintain it? These are not set and forget, right? There's always a degree of maintenance involved.
Totally agree. When it comes to maintenance, by the way, because a lot of the stuff we covered up till now is all around CapEx, your capital expenditure, like, okay, buying hardware. But how do you make a architecture and design for it so that you can also save on your operational expenses? Like how not to make your life difficult?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's a business decision. It really has to do with the circumstances you're in. I'm working with a client in the Middle East, and their internet costs are so extravagant that we can't afford to move the data across the internet. We have to ship the data in JBODs, in big hard drive chassis. Physically ship them there, and then all the sealing has to be done on site because we can't afford to push petabytes, through those links. They'd go broke. On the other hand, like here in the US, it's amazing how cheap bandwidth has gotten, so it becomes less of a factor. So you got to run the numbers, obviously, but then you would think about, okay, what's my burden, in terms of having this, having to purchase this equipment, what's its lifespan, what's the effective use I can get out of it. You really start looking at it from a cost perspective. And we know that there are new capabilities coming out very soon in the in the Lotus world in terms of some of the new algorithms, the new proofs that will allow us to seal with a very different hardware architecture. I mean, it's similar to what you're showing here, but it's substantially different that you have to consider, okay, what's that actually going to look like?
Yeah.
You know, buying new is, of course, a different burden.
Yeah, if there's one way to anticipate that change is maybe if you're buying servers, make sure you can host a lot more NVMe in them.
Absolutely.
Because that's gonna be where from GPU it will move more into NVMe over time, possibly.
Right. Yeah, right now we see, for instance, a huge overhead with RAM. And yeah, we see that moving, that shifting from RAM into NVMe, and doesn't mean what you have is a waste. It just means, you know, the balance shifts somewhat. And again, you kind of have to rebalance your entire system in terms of what's the peak efficiency. You know, all of us as experienced operators want to push and squeeze as much usage out of our systems with as much efficiency as possible, right? To reduce really our per unit costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree. You mentioned bandwidth in the US being very cheap. Where I live, that's not so cheap. I know regions in the world where it's even worse. What is a typical bandwidth? So I put 10 gig on here, but
Yeah.
I mean, is 10 gig mandatory? Can you do
No,
less?
Oh,
What's good and what's bad for you?
right. So as I mentioned, the operation I'm working on in the Middle East, we're looking at like the Daemon, we're using, you know, 4 or 5 megabits per second. So almost nothing. There is going to be no boost node connectivity to the internet because of the costs I mentioned. On the other hand, like at PikNik, we have multiple 100 gigabit per second lines going into our system. And as a very simple rule of thumb, think of it as for every 100 gigabit line I have, I can push, well, so let's say theoretically 1 pib a day. So if you're saying 10 gigabits, well, that means I can push, you know, 100 tibs a day. If, you know, if I've got 1 gig, I can push, you know, what's that, 10 tibs a day. That's a very rough theoretical max, not a, you know, not a true number, but it gives you a good round idea. So that goes back to how much am I sealing? How quick do I want to seal it? If I want to seal 100 tibs a day, well, you know, 10 gigs is going to be the minimum I need to order, unless the data is being sneaker netted in on JBODs. So again, those are variables you always have to consider. But yeah, absolutely. I think this is a great basic, you know, 1 pib raw machine setup.
Yeah. What would you do different from this template architecture? How if you were to start yourself, you look at this and you were like, oh, wait a bit, do I need? Would you skim off some of the components? Would you make some of them bigger? What would you do for your setup?
Yeah, just based on like on my own setup, you know, the post workers are nice to haves. Are they absolutely required? No, but you know, it's nice to have, to lose fewer blocks or miss posts because of contention. You've got probably a big enough miner that you could double up all that and combine all that into a single unit. So would I suggest that? Well, it depends on your financial position, right? If you got the money, post workers are great. I don't happen to use post workers, but I have a very small setup. So you just start thinking in terms of, you know, risk or reward, and you're definitely taking more risk, but you're also having a much more complicated system if you're going to, you know, if you're going to have a spread out system. I like the idea of like in your sealing cluster, you got a remote AP worker that can also do comp P. So that's quite nice. I like to separate that off. I actually have a separate dedicated remote AP DC worker in the sealing cluster so that it offloads from boost and it doesn't labor the PC1. The boost node's a nice size here. I use a much smaller system. I think it's 32 gig and it actually works quite well, but it's not going to handle, you know, the kind of capacity and throughput that we're talking about here. And then as you grow and scale, you could have, clusters of workers. You could group them, right, so that you have more balance and you could push a lot more through. But I don't think at one PIB you would really need that. Again, it goes to how quickly do you want to seal that one PIB? You want to seal it in a day, which is going to be really expensive, or are you going to take your time and seal the capacity? If you've got one PC, one worker, we're looking at what, like 15 sectors being sealed concurrently across like 3 to 4 hours each. So you could factor that in right there. And again, that's the existing architecture, not the coming architecture. So that really informed us. It's really math at this point.
It is, and scaling out from here is literally just either adding sealing capacity, going with a sealing as a service provider is the other option. So it scales pretty linearly. You could plan for a bigger boost to handle more load incoming, have a bigger sealing rig to handle more sealing capacity, and obviously miner will not do more, but you will need more storage capacity in the back. And there are people who have storage servers instead of a storage array attached. I rather prefer to have a storage array because it allows for horizontal scaling by adding more SAS expanders, and off you go.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Hey, Stu, you're one of the rare people in the ecosystem that runs an individual miner, but is also part of a larger organization that's got much larger scale. How do you think about the differences from the architectural standpoint on both of those? And kind of what is your prediction on how that architecture is going to scale, change over time, whether it's just from your individual miner or on the larger scale side?
Well, they'll both change. The larger scaling, the larger commercial operations obviously will change more substantially, I believe, just because we've got to stay on top of efficiency, and we've got the money for it, right? To continue to spend money to save money. Let's call it as a hobbyist, right? Running, I think I've got 4 machines operating a single miner ID at home. It's a very different calculation. I really value the home system as a test lab where I can see very, very carefully everything that's happening, especially as code changes and as the architecture changes. I can really understand what's happening under the covers. It's much harder when you have, 100 miner IDs or 500 hardware systems and trying to keep on top of all the logs and what's going on. You really have to understand what's happening underneath. So I use my home system as a lab, really, and a way of understanding things. And that way, when we start having problems in the large systems, I can advise our technical people, like, hey, have you looked at this? And what I found is that, and of course, work with Protocol Labs and the Lotus team, in terms of my feedback, for that. So yeah, it's going to change. I don't think it's going to be changed so radically. I'm going to put it all on a Raspberry Pi. But ultimately it becomes a choice of, like, do I still want to run a boost node? Do I still want to do my own sealing? Again, for me, it's more of a hobby in that regard.
If someone was entering the ecosystem here and they had dreams of being a big player like PikNik, is running that individual miner operation something that you'd recommend?
I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to your business. What are you trying to become? If you want to become another PikNik, and that means a lot of things in terms of, who are we serving? Who are the customers? What are their requirements? What parts of the market do we want into? What does business development look like? Then I think you're going to end up with a customized architecture that doesn't look like a generic architecture. So we have like a 5 PIB architecture that we actually sell. Like, we can say, you want to have a standalone system that will manage for you. We kind of modularized it 5 PIB, but for going, I want to have 100 PIB or 600 PIB or whatever that target is, then you're going to start looking at ways to consolidate some of these things. For instance, we had a nice chat the other day in the Slack community about how to scale like the daemons. So the first thing you say is, well, I don't want a single daemon. I want to pair them like an HA cluster. Well, that's great. And that way, if one fails, you've always got the chain in sync. You've always got something that is the heartbeat of your entire system. But in a large system, what happens is you're constantly upgrading versions of software, and you can't really run incompatible versions against each other. So we'll have two sets of daemons. We'll have like the current version of Lotus running on a pair of them, and then we'll have like the next version that's being staged, like a release candidate or feature release version running on the other ones, because their API versions are different. And then we can migrate on the back end all those hundreds of systems over to the newer version over the course of time, rather than trying to do a big bang, right? So that's kind of a typical thing in the scaling world, where you wouldn't do it exactly the way we have pictured here.
Yeah, but those concepts are great and go beyond the 0 to 1. I mean,
Yeah, it's sorry, it's definitely not 0 to 1. You know,
no, but great concepts indeed. High availability and resiliency and A/B testing of upgrades. Also, there much is coming out in terms of stability, and how the Lotus miner is working under the covers is also being rewritten for more stability and more upgradability and bandwidth. Are there any questions from the audience that should be answered?
Got one from Mr. God, John, I don't want to put Psycher Buke. Long time. I've never had to say your last name before, John. Can you break down the day in the life of a Filecoin stack system admin? How much of their day is spent doing orchestration, upgrading and testing, maintenance and repair? Thanks for the question, John.
okay. Let me make sure I understand the question. Right. So there's a great question here, I think, about it kind of goes to your architecture again, but it goes to the way, are you trying to reduce your personnel costs versus licensing costs? So for instance, one very interesting example out there is one of our presenters at ESPA is Akron Tech, and they've built a stack on top of a VMware solution that automates so much of the tasks. So they can have fewer people manage the system, but they're paying a much higher license cost. They believe that by paying the extra fees and licenses to VM, they can reduce the headcount in terms of how many people are required to operate it. So really, it's always that balance, right? How much automation, how much scripting versus just going out and doing things, right? So you're actually asking like a breakdown between orchestration, upgrading and testing, maintenance and repair, I think. So when it comes to like upgrading and testing, that is really highly reliant on the Lotus team because we use the vanilla Lotus software. We don't do modifications to it, which means we live by their schedule. So if they're going to release 4 times a year and they're going to give us 2 weeks of testing, well, that's your answer. 4 times a year times 2 weeks of testing, or whatever their cadence is. I have been pushing for fewer big upgrades and more testing time, because as you scale bigger, you just need more time. So that's really infrequent, but it happens. Orchestration, there's always people trying to figure out how to tune and tweak and change the system. We really have a guy who's devoted pretty much full time to doing that, right? Of just constantly tweaking and adjusting the system. Maintenance and repair, well, I think a lot of that's a factor of the type of equipment you're purchasing, right? We always recommend enterprise, class systems, right? Which will cost you more upfront, but will pay off long term in terms of less support time, less maintenance time. But of course, there's always that going. And then depending upon your choice, like in data centers, do you have direct access to the data center, or are you paying remote hands to do the work? So dropping in a few new hard drives at a data center that's qualified for that, they can do that work and we can just pay them for that. Otherwise, we have a guy jumps in his car, runs over to the data center, and replaces some bad hard drives, or, whatever, bad GPU, or, something that blows out, So that's again a question of how you've put all that together.
There's a lot to think of indeed when it comes to data center operations. Also, like redundant internet? Do you want to pay for all of your internet and all of your uplinks redundantly, or do you want to just pay the data center to plug in a cable into another port?
Right. I think the bigger question that hasn't been asked here, and it kind of goes to your point, Bob, is I often get asked about backups, right? And frankly, having a backup of the data that is being stored into the system does not scale very well, right? You got to think about, okay, what is my backup situation and what's my DR situation? Well, ideally, you're replicating the data across multiple SPs. Maybe you've got multiple data centers, so you're replicating the data across multiple data centers. And so there's a way to extract that data, right? Should one data center go down, and you never, ever lose the data set. And, there's all sorts of discussion about different ways of accomplishing that, but Filecoin, has, and Lotus has a natural way of doing that. There's, erasure coding. There's all sorts of ways of dealing with that, but you're not simply going to do straight backups at scale.
At scale, you cannot, but yeah, keep in mind that having a replica with another SP is not the same sector as you had it. So you cannot ever redo a PC1 sector creation. So
well, it depends, right? It depends if, one of the things we do is we'll retain car files that we distribute out to other SPs, right? And so those car files at 32 gig, as opposed to smaller deals, they should become identical. Now, you can't just copy the whole sealed sector, right? You have to extract the car file, or you have to have a copy of the car file. So there's, again, it's different approaches, depends on the customer.
Totally agree. And to Paul's question, how do you mitigate DDoS attacks? It's not covered entirely on this picture here, but a decent firewall should have you protected from a normal DDoS attack. So that's my advice. Go with a hardware firewall that is offering the capability for enough of a protection instead of just letting the internet hit your machines directly.
Yeah, some ISPs actually offer it. So instead of going through your pipe, right, you mitigate it up in the cloud. Let's say it's AT&T, and they can do DDoS prevention before it goes to your narrower pipe. So it just depends, right? Again, there's a cost question there. What's available with your ISPs. Again, if you look at the diagram, the protecting your daemon is far more important from a DDoS perspective than your deals, right? You can suffer a DDoS attack on your boost node and say, well, I guess we're not going to take some deals for a while, and maybe I stand up another boost node in another part of the world, and it really depends.
Yeah,
not 0 to 1 so much, but yeah.
Yeah, that's for when you come to ESPA and you want to scale out your business. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, as much as 0 to 1 is here to help you guys start your journey, as well as the Filecoin docs, we're trying to provide as many resources for you to get started as possible. But at the end of the day, there's still no better way to get indoctrinated into our community than ESPA. And Stu is a major player and contributor and organizer of the ESPA program. So Stu, I'd love to hear your thoughts on ESPA. How can people get involved and what they should know about it?
Yeah, great pitch. Thank you. So what people often don't realize, especially if they're coming out of a kind of a Web 2 mindset or non-Web 3, is really what makes the community and Filecoin work, and a lot of Web 3 work, frankly, is the community and the ability to work together. And what ESPA does is not simply teach you like the basics. I mean, we talk everything about tokenomics, sales, technical architecture, how to get data. We talk about everything soup to nuts. But what really happens there in the 3-day boot camp that we have is it's really about building community, building trust, learning, who you can work with directly, and start off in terms of, okay, I've got these trusted partners that I can talk to. We're not there charging you money to attend, right? It's really there to help build the community and grow the community. And I think the most successful SP participants are ones that really have those bonds between others. And here you get to meet people, have dinner with them, have lunch with them for 3 days and really bond. It's a great experience. And that really it's really hard to document and say, well, here, read this white paper. This is how it works. It's what happens. You know, by the time people come out of the third day, they've developed new relationships, they've had new business ideas, and often there's like partnerships forming, like, hey, we're not very good at this, but you guys could do that. And so you end up with people kind of modifying how they're going to move forward, and end up with people that will really help them grow and become successful. This isn't a pie that we have to slice up and figure out who gets what piece of the pie. The pie is huge, you know, and we all just want to succeed, and by helping each other succeed, we all succeed.
When is the next cohort?
Next cohort, July 18th through 20th. Hopefully we can I can put a link in there if you haven't.
I already dropped the waitlist link into the chat.
Yeah, click on the wait list, and that doesn't give you that doesn't guarantee your spot there, but you know, it puts on a list, and we'll get back to you and find out what you're looking for and see if we can squeeze you in.
Yeah, we run these every quarter. So if you don't make July, there's always October and first next year. So plenty of opportunity to put ESPA on your radar. As always, there's plenty of ways to engage with the community. As Stu said, this is really what makes Web3 unique, what makes Filecoin special. My favorite part about working in the ecosystem is the community. It's so energizing, innovative. I think once you get to know everyone within our ecosystem, you will become addicted as well. The best ways to engage with the community is on Twitter with Filecoin SP, on Slack, the global storage provider community. And be sure, as always, to read the Filecoin docs. This is your best one-stop shop for just understanding what it takes to get going as a storage provider. I know a lot of the questions in the chat have revolved around hardware requirements and where do I get started? What do I need to know? Filecoin docs is the best one-stop shop for you to get going. Tune in next week, as always, where we will be covering more topics around becoming a Filecoin storage provider. Next month we'll be focusing on where to get data as we talk about setting up your capacity. What you want to do with said capacity is to fill it up with useful data, and that can be more complicated than people realize. You want to understand the economics behind getting data. How do you ingest the data? Even from like remote locations such as the Middle East that Stu referenced earlier. There's a lot of things that you want to consider to make sure that you're starting off on the right foot and on your path to profitability. And with that, Bob, Stu, send us out. Time just flew here. Stu, let me just leave you with this before we get out of here today. If you were to leave this group with one piece of insights, what would it be and why?
Right. Well, you've heard me say it before, but I'll repeat it again because it's that important. Understand what you're trying to accomplish. What is your target? What's your goal? What do you really want to accomplish? Laser focus on that, and then involve the community, involve others so that you're not trying to figure it out on your own, because I guarantee if you do it by yourself, you're going to make mistakes. It's going to be costly. It's going to be painful. Reduce the pain, work with the rest of us. We're here to help you. That's it.
Bob, final thought, final word.
Amen. All is said.
All right. Thank you all for joining. See you next month for another 0 to 1.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for attending.